Okay, so welcome everybody. My name is Dan Gullery. I'm the test prep director here at Ruth and Rex Learning Space. I have with me Henry Moss, one of our seasoned test prep teachers, who's also one of our test prep materials developers. I guess I should say our only one currently. So Henry, thanks for joining us. Henry will sort of hang out in the chat. If there are any questions that come through the chat, Henry will either, if it's a quick question, just answer it via text. If it's a longer question or one that maybe pertains to more people, Henry will just sort of interrupt me between slides and we'll sort of address questions as they come in that way. So Henry, you're free to kick back without your camera on and just let me know when any questions come through. Okay, so basically we are here today or this evening to talk about the SSAT. I want to talk a little bit about the ins and outs of the test itself, what it's all about, what's on it, what it's worth in terms of school applications, how preparation works and all those kinds of things. So I did get all of the questions that you had submitted if you did submit questions with your registration. So I will do my best to answer all of those questions to the best of my ability. If there's anything that comes up as I'm talking that you have questions about, feel free to, like I said, either send a chat or ask a question in Zoom. We'll sort of watch both of those things happening. Okay. So just some, I guess just a quick, outline of how we'll be doing things, general information about the test, registration for the test, any accommodations and how they work, a breakdown of the sections and what they look like, understanding the scoring of the test, the difficulty level of the test itself, how preparation works, and then question and answer period at the end. So this is scheduled until 8:30. My goal is usually to get us through the slides by about 8 or 8:10. And then if there are questions after that, we go, until 8:30. If we need to go to 8:40, 8:45, we can certainly do that. And then at the end, I will, my email address will be up at the end. It's dan@ruthrumac.com. I'm happy to answer any other questions that you may have. If you realize that, 10 p.m. tonight that you wanted to ask me about something or something didn't make sense, you're free to send an email my way and I'm happy to answer. Okay, so general information, the SSAT stands for Secondary School Admissions Test, although it is also for middle school. So there's a middle level and an upper level. It's a suite of tests put together by the Enrollment Management Association. Sorry, I had a hard time saying that. So there are 3 tests technically, elementary, middle, and upper. There are no schools in Toronto or in Canada, as far as I'm aware, that ask for the elementary test. So that would be written by students in grade 3 or 4, depending on where they're applying. But the 2 that we focus on here, because they are the 2 that are used, are the middle level and the upper level. So middle level is admission to middle school. So it's for students who are applying to grade 7 or 8, and they are taken in the fall of the grade 6 year. The upper level is for students applying to grades 9 through 12, although generally speaking, unless you're applying to grade 9, it's not really used in Canada. There are a few schools who will ask for it for grade 10 and 11, but if you're applying to grade 12, it's mostly through attrition, and they're not really looking at your SSAT score because they can't compare your score to what grade 8 students are doing. But again, it is taken in the winter of or fall winter of the year prior to the year that they're applying for. So if you're applying for grade 9, you would write it in grade 8 about 9 months before your grade 9 year would start. Okay, so the test itself is fairly straightforward in terms of registration. You have to make an account on SSAT.org. It is a bit of a lengthy process. The first time you do it, it does take about 45 minutes, so you do need to set some time aside. And they will ask you for quite a bit of information in terms of your child and what you're actually looking to do. The one big thing that I'll stress here, and I will stress it again later on, is number 3, reporting. It will always ask you to select which schools you'd like your scores to be sent to. You should always select none. Once the scores have been submitted, you will get a notification that the scores have been submitted. You can go and look at those scores. If they're scores that you're happy with, then you can manually have them released to whichever schools you're applying to. If you're not happy with them, you can have your kid retake the test and then only select the scores that you're happy with to be submitted to the schools. If you select the schools right away at the beginning, all scores from all tests that your child takes will be automatically sent to that school. It might work in their favor sometime if they see that your kid did, rather poorly on the first test and did better on the second test. But if your kid does roughly the same on the first two tests and then does a little bit better, it doesn't always look great if there are multiple test scores being submitted. So it's best to just give your best score and manually submit that one. Also for number 4, optional add-ons, there are a ton of additional add-ons that they offer for an additional fee. None of them are worth it at all. I mean, I don't work for the SSAT, but that's my general take on it. You don't need a printed score. You don't need expedited submission. All of those things, as long as you write by as long as you write the test by the day that they require it to be written by, it's out of your hands to know how long it'll take to be submitted to the school. So no school says we need the scores by this date. All schools will say we need it written by this date. And then it is the $149 for each test that you take. So I'll come back to that in a second. So this year, they haven't yet announced what's actually happening with COVID, but I do just want to talk about what happened last year and what the possibilities are for this year. So last year, there were 3 in-person tests in all of Ontario. All 3 of them happened at De La Salle, and they filled up very, very quickly. You were only allowed to take one of those because of the limited seats. So if you registered for an in-person test at De La Salle and weren't happy with your score, you would have to actually do an online test after that. The online test is very secure. There were a few hiccups throughout the testing, which always happens with any sort of online platform. A few kids did end up having to retake their test because the scores weren't submitted properly to the SSAT. But for the most part, it went pretty smoothly. What happens is they sort of log into your computer remotely. They'll ask you to allow them access to your webcam and your microphone. You need to show them around your room to make sure that there's nobody else in there, that you don't have any electronic devices with you. You have to show them your blank scrap paper before you start. And then they basically just watch you take the test without you seeing them on the screen. So, if you remember that they're there, you remember that they're there, but you're not staring at somebody watching you the entire time. They haven't made any announcements as to what they're going to do this year. My gut instinct is that they will continue to offer online testing because they were able to offer it to more people at a lower cost to them, obviously not at a lower cost to the person who's writing it. But on a general year, you can take as many tests as you'd like. There are no limitations like there were last year with up to 5 per school year and only 1 in person. Generally speaking, you can take as many as you'd like, but we'll talk about retests and they're not always worth it. They also have something called a flex test, which I believe is on a later slide, but I'll just mention it right now. Flex tests are basically unofficial testing dates that schools or individual proctors have put together where they want to offer the test. You are only allowed to write 1 of those per year. So if you have, if you're looking on the website and looking for a testing date and it says flex next to it, just know that you won't be able to write a test on another flex date. There's no difference on the test though. And then, like I said, it's $149 per test. And as information comes out from the SSAT organization, we will advise families on, what's going on and how students are able to write the tests this year. So just quickly about accommodations, and I know a lot of you will have individual questions about accommodations for your kids. Generally speaking, any accommodation on this test is given if that accommodation is something that a student is given in school. So if a student gets extra time in school, you can apply to have extra time on this test and they will generally grant that. If a student requires a smaller testing room, most of the tests, I assume, will be happening online this year, so that won't necessarily be an issue. But the big thing to know is that you need to be approved before you register for the test. So you need to have paperwork or at least somebody ready from your child's school who is willing to say, yes, I am in charge of some sort of guidance or accommodations or something like that, and this is what the child gets at school. Some accommodations you will need to pay for yourself if it's an actual person who needs to be there. So if your child has a scribe or a reader in school, you will need to provide that person on your own. It does need to be somebody who has no vested interest in their score on this test. So it can't be you, it can't be somebody who's working with them on preparation. It could be a classroom teacher, but it can't be somebody who, a relative or somebody who has an interest above them doing well, like feeling proud for them as a family member, or being able to show people as a test prep professional, look how much I helped this student, because it's not fair. But we can talk more about those, the ins and outs of that as we move through these slides. Okay, so how is it scored? So this is basically the big question in terms of scoring. A lot of schools will say that they want the scaled score, not the percentile ranking. A lot of students will say vice versa. So let me just kind of explain how this all works. There's a raw score that your child will get after they write the test. There are 4 graded sections of this test and 1 unscored section, which is the written component. It's just sent to schools for them to see what kind of writer your child is. But there are 4 multiple choice graded sections. So the raw score is basically calculated by the number of correct answers minus a quarter mark for every incorrect answer. Skipped questions do not count for or against. So if on a section of 40 questions, your child answers 30 of them correctly and 4 of them incorrectly, it would be 30 points minus a quarter point for each. So they would end up with a 29 out of 40. From there, the raw score is converted to a scaled score, which is basically an inflated number like the SAT does, where they take your score and they put it onto a chart between a certain number of numbers in the hundreds. So for middle level, it's between 459 to 710, which is kind of arbitrary. For the upper level, it's 500 to 800, which somehow makes a little bit more sense in the larger scheme of things, but still they're arbitrary numbers. Those numbers stay the same year after year. The score that you get is inflated to a scaled score. The percentile ranking changes from year to year because the percentile ranking is looking at your child's score and comparing that score to all of the other scores from kids who've taken the test in North America over the past 3 years at the same grade level as your child. So if your child is in grade 6 applying to grade 7, their score will be weighted against everybody else from the past 3 years in North America in grade 6 who have taken the SSAT. And they'll also break it down by gender as well. So you will have a score that's just based on how you did at grade level, as well as grade level and gender. So basically, you're looking at something between the first percentile at the very bottom and the 99th percentile at the very top. Obviously, because you have to do better than 99%, there is no 100th percentile. But the 99th percentile is virtually impossible to reach, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and how the schools read those scores right now. So what makes a good score? Every school has different expectations. No school in Toronto is expecting anything really above the 90th percentile. Even the 90th percentile is only really University of Toronto schools for the upper level. On any given year, if you're placing above the 80th percentile, you have a very good shot at applying to UTS or being admitted to UTS. For most other schools, they're willing to look at any score that you submit to them, but obviously the better the score that you can submit, the better your chance of being admitted. So, what we generally advise is that a score above the 50th percentile is something to be proud of in terms of, applying to a school like De La Salle or a school like, for something like Upper Canada College, the test is optional. You can also write their in-person test, but if you're submitting your SSAT, they do want to see something a little bit higher. A school like St. Mike's, I've worked with students who have gotten in, at the 40th percentile. I've also worked with students who at the 60th percentile weren't accepted to the school. It really is dependent on a lot of external factors. So they take your test score, they look at your report card, they look at your extracurriculars. So there's a lot that goes into it. Really, what it comes down to is the best score that you can submit I guess increases your shot at being accepted. So, if you can score higher than 60th percentile, then that's where, we should be aiming. But what we find in terms of preparation is because of the difficulty of this test, most students are starting at a very low point. On average, most students are starting on their first placement test below the 20th percentile. And that doesn't mean that they don't know 80% of the material that they should know. We'll talk a little bit more about how that can be interpreted and why this is such a difficult test. Basically, if you're looking in the Northeast corridor of the United States, so, sort of Boston to Washington, D.C., and then Silicon Valley on the West Coast, that's where we're looking at scores where, the schools are looking for 96th, 97th percentile and won't consider a score below that. Those kids are prepping for 2 years of their lives, unless they're little baby geniuses and they happen to be good at taking tests, which usually means, there's they're really, focused on exclusively academics, but there's so much else going on with this test that, even if you're an A student, you're still usually placing at about the 25th or 30th percentile on your first placement test, just because of the nature of the questions and how it's put together. So you don't need to worry about 96th percentile in Canada at all, is what I'm saying. So why is it so hard? So the first thing is that the math is basically 2 years ahead of the curriculum. So again, you don't need to answer every single question in order to have a fantastic score on this test. If you are able to answer every single math question on this test, you are basically operating 2 years ahead of the standard curriculum, and you are really good with playing with logic, because a lot of the questions are not just straightforward math. You really have to read between the lines and figure out what's going on. So there's a lot happening with with these math questions. There are 50 of them in total. So that's the first thing. The next thing is the reading section. They rely on older texts. So all of the text all of the fiction texts will be out of copyright. So they're, most of them are about 100 years old. They do also rely on some poetry, which can be extremely difficult. And then the nonfiction texts are usually a little bit more dense, or quite a bit more dense than what students are used to seeing. But the questions themselves are also extremely tricky. Even if you are an avid reader and you really understand what you've just read, it's not, these aren't questions like, tell me what the main character said to the other character. They really ask you to dig deep and answer questions like, what can you infer about the author's intentions, in including the second line of the third paragraph. So, you're really looking at higher level concepts than, what kids are used to seeing in school for reading comprehension. The next thing is that there's 60 vocabulary words, or I should say 60 vocabulary questions. All of those come with 5 answer choices. So there's, essentially upwards of 400 with the analogy questions, upwards of 400 vocabulary questions on this test. Sorry, vocabulary words. There are 60 vocabulary questions. But knowing what the word antecedent means in the question word doesn't necessarily mean that you'll know what the answer choice is. So it's sort of it's a game that you're playing on multiple levels with these vocabulary words. The next thing is limited time. So each section is quite short in terms of the number of questions that you have. Like I said, there are a lot of trick questions and red herring answers. And then kids are also looking at point deductions if they answer questions incorrectly, which can quickly rack up and work against them. Okay, so I want to give you a few sample questions so that you can understand the full difficulty of this, because I can often tell parents that it's very difficult, but thinking about the middle level, so this is grade 6 students, these are some sample questions from actual practice tests. So number 1, at a certain school, 5 classes, each with 20 students, wish to form 3 clubs. If every student must belong to exactly 1 club and the membership of no club may outnumber the membership of another by more than 1, what is the least possible number of students in 1 club? So again, this is a question where, reading the actual text of the question it's wordy, it feels a bit intimidating, and then you're asked to actually figure out what's going on here. So you need to have a strategy at approaching these kinds of word questions. The next question, a very common type of question for the middle level test for grade 6, has to do with bedmass or order of operations. So, explaining to a student what 2 to the power of 3 means, or, even 3 to the power of 2, understanding powers, understanding how to read questions where, multiplication is indicated by brackets rather than by an X. Looking at these kinds of things can be extremely intimidating for a student, and understanding how to actually learn this material can take quite a bit of time and practice. For the upper level quantitative, to give you an example of a word problem from this one, a burger joint sells an average of 250 burgers a day. The manager plans to increase the price of the burger from $8 to $10. How many burgers must the restaurant sell for $10 if the daily sales are to remain the same as when the price of the burger was $8? So again, there's quite a bit of complex math going on here. Understanding what the question is actually asking, making a plan for how to answer it, and then looking at the answer choices and finding the appropriate answer is a lengthy process with 25 math questions in 30 minutes. So there are 2 math sections, each with 25 questions. Another example, at a local zoo, the number of ostriches is twice that of elephants. The total number of legs combined between the ostriches and elephants at the zoo is 80. How many ostriches are in the zoo? So really these questions are, they're reminiscent of those sort of joke questions when people talk about, how tricky math can be, where, a train leaves Los Angeles and a train leaves New York and each is traveling at 60 miles an hour. How long will it take for them to meet in Chicago? Like, there's just so much going on that you have to consider. And, the test does rely on students feeling overwhelmed. And unfortunately, that is the nature of this test, is that it is pretty brutal in terms of what it's asking kids to do and what they're used to being asked in school. And in a way, this, for a lot of kids that we work with, is the first time that they're really challenged to the point where they have to accept failure before they can start to see progress. And I know that's very difficult for a lot of parents to sort of place on their child and to feel like, that it's something that they want to put their kid through. But it's the reality of this test. And, oftentimes kids come out feeling like, wow, I really accomplished something bigger than what I'm used to accomplishing. So it can be a pretty, a pretty wonderful experience, I guess I could say, for a lot of kids. Okay, so I won't read this whole poem to you, but this is an example of a poem from a practice test that we work with, where it's a conversation between a man and a fish. And what's happening here? So looking at this, astonished looking, angle-faced, dreary-mouthed, gaping wretches of the sea, gulping salt water everlastingly. There's a lot going on just, in the first couple lines. Amazing monster, for aught I know, with the first sight of thee didst make our race. So, kids, honestly, I have a hard time with this poem, and, my background is in English, secondary English education. That's what I did my original degree in. So, whether they can get through the poem or not, getting to the question, one, the poem relies heavily on which two literary devices. So, you might know rhyme and suspense, whether you know contrast and imagery, whether you know simile and puns, onomatopoeia, paradox. Most of these have at least one word in them that students won't be familiar with. So it can be very daunting when you look at this kind of question. And we do have strategies, obviously, for working through all of the things that, that I've presented to you so far. But, to expect a kid to be able to go in this blind and feel comfortable with it and come out, feeling accomplished is usually, it can be, sort of a recipe for disaster in a lot of ways. And then just to give you an example of the synonyms and analogies in terms of the vocabulary. So a word like avarice, whether you know what avarice means, doesn't necessarily mean that you know what the answer choices mean. Same with dexterity. And this is exactly how it would be presented on the test. And then again, for analogies, we have neonatal is to geriatric. So understanding the relationship between those two words, if you know what they mean, and then knowing what the words in the answer choices mean. Again, spec is to iota, as type is to. So, again, knowing what iota is the deal breaker between understanding the relationship between the analogy words and, not being able to answer the analogy. So I'm trying to get rid of my shadow a little bit here, but it doesn't seem to be working. So, there's two of me. So anyway, yeah, I mean, there are definitely some good strategies for working through these kinds of things. But again, giving students the confidence to work through this test is, I would say, almost as important as, knowing how to work through the actual material on this test. So with all that being said, now that I've scared you and told you how difficult this test is, I want to talk a little bit about what test prep is, but I feel like there are probably some questions about the test itself and the difficulty level and those sorts of things. So if anybody has any questions right now, I'm happy to answer them. If you want to, put them in the Q&A or the chat, we can certainly have a quick question period about the test and what it's all about. I do feel like I missed a slide that was talking about the number of questions on each section. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so for the math, there's 50 questions split into 2 sections. You have 30 minutes for each of them. There's no difference between the sections. It's not that one is harder or easier or that they're in a different format. It's just split between 2, one toward the beginning and one toward the end. There's also the reading section, which is 40 questions, about 7 or 8 passages in 40. So 40 questions, 40 minutes. That one is the most brutal in terms of time constraints. And then you have your verbal section, which we just looked at. There's 60 questions. half of them are synonyms, so the first few that we saw on that page, and half of them are analogies, so it's the second half of that page. And the vocabulary is challenging. There's no way around that. And then there's the written section. You're given 2 prompts to write about. For the middle level, you get a nice creative prompt to write. So, I stared at the empty street when I heard from the empty room, ... and they can continue. So that's one option for middle level. The other option for middle level is an essay question, usually something like, what are the most important traits of a good citizen? For an upper level student, so a student applying for grade 9, they won't have a creative prompt, they'll have 2 essay prompts. So one of them might look something like a personal essay. One of my favorite things about school is, and then another one might be a world essay. So, one of the most pressing issues in the world today is blank and why. So that's basically how that works in terms of, the writing portions between the 2 tests. So we talked about these, amazing. Let's talk about test prep. So, as I've sort of said already, test prep is extremely important in terms of getting kids ready for this. One thing that I hear a lot from parents is, I did the SAT or I did the LSAT, and, I went through tests and I, practiced on my own and I was pretty comfortable by the time I took it. And, we also work on SAT prep. We also do offer some LSAT prep. I will say the big difference between those kinds of tests, well, there's bigger differences between them. The difference between something like the LSAT and the SSAT, besides the obvious, is that on the LSAT, there's really no outside knowledge required. It's more of a logic game and understanding how to work with the questions that you're given in a logical way. So, you can work on question after question and feel more comfortable with the way that they ask questions and how to work through them on your own if you're a logical person. On the SAT or the ACT, which you would take in the US before you apply to university, those kinds of tests are generally based on what you've learned in school. There are a few tricks that you need to learn in terms of how to answer questions, and there's a lot of review happening with those kinds of things where they're asking you things that you haven't touched in 2 years. But this test, like I said, really goes beyond what students are used to seeing, and it's also designed to be, I would say in a lot of ways, harder for students to take at grade level than the SAT or the ACT is. So, and I guess the other bigger thing, like I said, is, the confidence boosting. For a lot of kids, this will be the first time that they feel like they have failed at something, or I guess in a nicer way to say it, it'll be the first time where they feel like something hasn't come really easily to them if they're a good student or if they're, a hardworking student in school. So really what we're looking at here is minimizing anxiety and maximizing their performance and their self-confidence. For a lot of kids, who come into this, we will realize right away that, they're not a 90th percentile student. And that's something that we work with parents a lot. I know that there are a lot of, promises that can be made about, score improvements and things like that. But, there really are caveats with all of those promises. There's no place that can guarantee a score improvement by a certain amount in a certain amount of time, because every student comes from a different place and every student learns at a different pace. So, what we do is really work with kids on an individual basis for the most part. We start with a diagnostic test and we see, okay, here are the things that this kid is already able to do. Here are the things that they need to learn. And here's what we can feasibly teach them within this number of lesson hours and with this amount of time before the actual test. So that's sort of how we do our test prep. Currently, we don't have any in-person lessons still. We are waiting for more of our staff to be able to get their second vaccine and then for, restrictions to be lifted, obviously. So, we're hoping that by the fall, we will be able to resume some in-person lessons. But, with test prep in particular, and, we've gone virtual with all of our services, so all of our academic services are online. Test prep has been by far the easiest to convert to in-person because all of our material is test material that comes in print and we're able to do it on the screen. Whereas, with other kids, they're bringing their homework and those kinds of things, and it is easier for us to be next to a person at a desk. That being said, a lot of people are just, they enjoy in-person learning more, and we are ready to move back to it as well. But we will continue to offer virtual lessons moving forward, even when we fully reopen for in-person, for students who prefer that, or for, if you're further away. Okay, so our test prep teachers, there's Henry, who you saw at the beginning. We are passionate and awesome. We are, and I'm okay. I'm going to like totally sell us, but we're all, we all have an education background, so we approach this from a place of actual teaching rather than, a group of people who are doing their university degrees or something like that who happen to be good test takers. We are good test takers, but we're also good teachers. So, what we really focus on is building a curriculum for each of our students and watching them move through that curriculum and constantly reevaluating whether we're moving too quickly or we can, whether we can speed up. Kids really learn at different paces. And, but I would say by the third lesson, we're usually really good at picking up on what kinds of background issues are happening with students that prevents them from moving forward more quickly. So one of the common things that we see is that they're jumping to answers really quickly rather than giving each answer choice a fair evaluation. Another thing that we often see is that some kids who are progressing a little bit more quickly will get way too confident with this test. And one thing that we do talk about a lot is humility with this, because this test is out to get you and you need to stand guard. As soon as you let your guard down, that's where you open up the door for falling into their traps. So again, we work with a wide range of students, from a lot of, different diverse backgrounds. But really at the core of it, we're working with each individual student and, coming up with an individual curriculum for them to help them move through it. So again, I mentioned we do work with some other tests, but basically, the other thing that we often focus on is the admissions and interview prep. So some kids will come for our interview workshop that we offer in the fall. Other kids will want that built in into their one-on-one prep that they do with us. So basically, we're also talking about the admissions process itself, as well as what a school interview looks like. So this isn't just come and learn how to take the test. This is really come, and a lot of it is filling in some of the cracks in the foundations that students have missed in terms of the curriculum in school. Some of it is reteaching some of the things that they've forgotten. A lot of it is teaching new material, but we're also looking at broader social, I wouldn't say social skills, but broader skills in terms of how to talk to people that they don't necessarily know, how to talk about themselves in a positive way, knowing what kinds of things are good talking points and what kinds of things maybe you want to avoid when you're talking to an admissions officer. So these are all things that we're comfortable with. And then obviously any tests that, any individual private school entrance tests, we're also happy to help with those things, Royal St. George's and, schools like that offer their own individual tests that they sort of put together each year. We're still very comfortable with the way that those tests work. Okay, so this is sort of the recapitulation of the spiel I just gave in terms of how we do things. So strategic learning, individualized lesson. We do a lot of homework for students who are working on test prep because they need to practice what they're learning. And then communication with parents and students themselves about what kinds of progress they're making. So I want to talk a little bit about how these lessons work. Generally speaking, like I said, a kid will start with a diagnostic test, and that test will be analyzed by one of the test prep teachers or myself, and we'll look at everything that they've done from the number of answers that they answered correctly and the number that they answered incorrectly to the rate at which they slowed down by the end of the 3-hour test, because it's a 3-hour test, to how much they ran out of time on the reading section, or it looks like they really thought that they knew this material, but they didn't know how to translate it to the questions on the test. So all of those pieces will be sort of analyzed by us from the test point, but also point of view, but also from an educational standpoint, where we're looking at, okay, how are we going to attack these things, and how are we going to teach these students what they need to know within the time that we have. And from there, that's when we work with the family to decide how many hours are going to be required for them to do this preparation, how many times per week should they be coming, what kind of homework schedule should they have in terms of additional work that they're doing outside of the preparation. So it really is individualized in terms of the student. There's no one size fits all solution in terms of like, here's when you should start preparing, because every student is coming at this from a different place, and every school has different requirements in terms of what they're looking for in terms of a score. So I know that a few people had asked, when should preparation start? My general answer to that is there's no way to know without doing a diagnostic test. We might see on a diagnostic test that a student is placing below the 10th percentile on every section, which is not abnormal. And from there, we might see that actually they know quite a bit of higher level material, but they're making a lot of silly mistakes. They are answering too many questions that they don't know the answers to, and they're losing a lot of points on incorrect answers. For another student at at the 5th percentile, which means that they're doing better than 5% of the other people who've had their official scores submitted to the SSAT. So that's another thing I want to touch on. For somebody who's starting at the 5th percentile, it might be that, they really need to fill in the foundations for their knowledge on a lot of the math and the reading comprehension strategies. For that kind of student, we will always have a discussion with the parents where we're realistic about what kinds of progress can be made. A lot of parents, will say, we want UTS, which is arguably the hardest school in Toronto to get into. And, from a diagnostic test, we might say, this may not be a reality with the amount of time that we have. And it's an unfortunate conversation to have, but it's also a necessary conversation to have, rather than saying, yeah, we can totally do it. Let's get them ready. And then, feeling like we're ending in failure. It's not to say that there's never a chance, but just based on reality and what we're used to seeing, we are able to give, I guess, more well-rounded or I guess more concrete ideas or predictions of what students are going to be able to do and how we're going to be able to help them. And then what I did also want to mention in terms of the way that the percentile ranges are given on the first diagnostic test, it's obviously not fair to compare their score as a first-time test taker to somebody who's done preparation and taken the official test. But the way that the scores are done, that's the only way that we can really do it. So essentially what we're saying is if they were to take the official test today, this is likely where they would place as a score. And here's what we would likely be able to get them to given 10 hours, 16 hours, 30 hours or more of one-on-one preparation. So the next thing I want to talk about is group prep. So the second option that a lot of people will go with is 2-to-1 preparation, which means that 2 people, like you can see here, these are not real SSAT students, they're too old, but they're actors. So they are prepping as friends on their MacBooks with one teacher helping both of them at the same time. So that's obviously at a discounted rate to both of the families. And the curriculum is sort of split down the middle between what each student needs. Sometimes students will feel more comfortable when they're doing it with a friend. Sometimes, students just feel like they're really on the same page in terms of the preparation and they want to do it together. But obviously splitting the attention between 2 students is basically splitting it 50-50. So it's not just the attention, but also the curriculum and what we're able to focus on in terms of what we're seeing individually with each student. We still can, obviously individualize it a little bit, but it becomes a little bit less it becomes a little bit less targeted the more people that we add on. So we also offered small group classes, usually toward the end of the summer. These are intro points to the SSAT. So they are by no means in 10 hours of group prep, by no means would we be able to get a student up to the 80th percentile, given where most students start. This is a stepping stone so that they can understand what the test is all about, some strategies on how to answer questions, and then at the end, we'll give a report card that says, here are the things that your child needs to work on. And you can either do the preparation on your own with a workbook, or you can do one-on-one lessons where we can work with them on meeting those goals. Okay. The next thing is, this is the end. Okay, maybe I just talked really quickly, but we got through this in record time. So I am impressed and I'm happy to answer any questions now. If you don't have any, or if you need to run, feel free to send me an email with any questions that you have in the meantime. Or, if you'd like to set up a call to discuss anything that we talked about today with me, feel free to get in touch with our front desk at either, I think both phone numbers are the same now because we're all at home these days. So yeah, whether you call Midtown or downtown, it goes to the same place, somebody's house. So feel free to ask for a phone call with me if you have some more individual questions that you'd like answered. And that's it. Thank you. So I will wait to see if any questions come up. Usually there are a few. So please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A. Henry, I think we did definitely make record time here this evening. I don't know how I did it.
Yeah, that was definitely faster than last time for
So
sure.
you can hang around for a bit if you'd like to, or you can,
Yeah, and I'll hang and let's see if anybody
yeah,
has questions that they're wondering about.
sure.
Okay, so we're going here.
Okay, so yeah, we have a first question here, just in terms of students with any kind of LD. I will say I'll talk specifically about ADHD, and I'll talk more broadly about any sort of like diagnosis or LD. So essentially, it's a brutal test. On one hand, a student with ADHD will often get additional time in school. If they do that on this test, it bumps them from a 3-hour test to a 4.5-hour test, which is usually so shockingly ridiculous for a kid who is either a preteen or just before they start high school, that it sometimes is not worth it. Or, in general, there are a lot of strategies that we can put in place for a student who has ADHD, where we're looking at how the student is interacting with the test and giving themselves breaks and things like that. I will say that obviously with any LD and standardized testing, it does become a little bit more difficult for that student. That being said, it's certainly not a deal breaker, but it's definitely something that we want to consider as we're working through looking at which kinds of accommodations they might want to get, and that would actually help them on this test, as well as looking at strategies for working through it. And I think particularly for building confidence, that this is actually something that they will be able to do, but it will take time and practice. So I don't know if that's enough of an answer to that question. In terms of how they do on the test, it really, again, depends on the individual student. I do find that, students who have some kind of LD, when they're given the appropriate accommodations, they're able to do quite well. When we overload them with accommodations, that's when, kids who may not need an additional hour and a half on this test will find more time to sort of, either, zone out or, sort of get distracted or whatever it may be, and it can sometimes work against them rather than working for them. Again, it really does depend on the individual student. And I know there's another question here in terms of how far in advance you need to prepare. I would say that I'll answer this question in closing my previous answer. So looking at how a student is performing from the beginning is really the indicating factor of where they need to start and how much work needs to be done. I generally say it's almost June now. This is a perfect time to do a diagnostic test. Oftentimes we'll say we have the whole summer ahead of us. We can go an hour a week for the whole summer and get them ready. We might say they're already really far advanced. We don't need to start right now. We can wait until September. So we don't have to do anything over the summer, but it really would depend on that initial diagnostic to let us know what would be most appropriate in terms of starting preparation. In terms of how many hours are appropriate, again, it depends on what that initial diagnostic looks like. What we offer in terms of packages are between 10 hours of one-on-one prep and 30 hours of one-on-one prep. Obviously, you can purchase multiple packages, but that's sort of how they work. What we normally recommend for students who are placing below the 25th percentile is a 30-hour package. What we normally recommend for a student placing above the 60th percentile is a 10-hour package. But again, those aren't set in stone. That's sort of dependent on, some of the more, intricate details of their analysis and how they're doing on things. So, but again, I will say, like, in terms of the number of hours and in terms of when a kid should start, now is a perfect time to actually look at the reality of where they are and where they need to be in terms of the school they're applying to. So we're happy to do a diagnostic test for any student. Basically, the way that works is it's an addition. It's not an additional fee. It's an initial fee of $330, and that cost is then deducted from any package or plan that you go with. So it's sort of a down payment if some parents will decide, you know what, this is too much. We're not going to put our kid through this right now. It's basically just the cost of our time for the analysis, as well as setting up an account for them on that diagnostic test. I will also add that we're doing our diagnostic tests remotely right now. So it's done through a testing service that we register the kid for with an account so they can do it online. It's timed appropriately. If they have accommodations, we're able to give them appropriate accommodation time as well. So that's basically how it's done. In normal times, in the old times, we would have a kid come into our center and write the test in person, and it would be proctored by somebody at the center so that they can see what an actual test proctoring situation looks like. So the next question, applying for grade 9, where a child is currently in grade 6, it could potentially be too early to do one-on-one preparation. I will say that, starting with a workbook that's appropriate for the testing, the testing level that they're approaching is a good idea if you're looking at more than a year in advance, where a kid is able to look through what's actually going to be expected of them and what they need to know versus what they actually know at this point. So if you have more than a year, so this, this kid by the time they're in grade 8, so they basically have, almost 2 years before they need to write this test. It would be appropriate in terms of doing some preliminary preparation, but it wouldn't necessarily. So it's always a fine line between how much are we going to be teaching them that they will be learning the next school year, and that overlap and what you're paying for versus what they'll eventually learn anyway, versus, having them preparing early so that they're able to do really well. The way that it works in the US with a lot of the schools that are looking for really high scores is that the private elementary and middle schools are doing sometimes 2 hours of SSAT prep a week with kids 2 years before they actually start the test. So it's built into the curriculum and it's part of the expectation that they're not doing overlap. And that's actually how they're teaching, which means they're teaching to the test, which is a terrible way to go through elementary or middle school, but that's the reality of how those kids are getting 97th percentile. So again, yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions about individual cases of how that might work. You can certainly shoot me an email, and we can talk about what kinds of workbooks might be appropriate and how how that preparation might start before before doing real one-to-one. Okay, so I'll wait around for a few minutes for any other questions that come in. Like I said, my email, so ruthrumack.com at the bottom of the screen here is our website. My email is dan@ruthrumack.com. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. You can also just send a general email through the website if you don't remember. It'll be forwarded to me, as soon as they see test prep. Yeah, of course. Thank you. Thank you. And if you don't have any further questions, feel free to sign off and enjoy your evening.